All right, if folks can have a seat to give us a little bit of perspective and opening benediction, a man who needs no introduction in this group, the person more responsible than anyone for helping to spearhead this concept of a Denver Startup Week, Eric Matisek.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. This is a really special panel, and it's really fun actually to be here with this group, because when I think about Denver Startup Week and I think about how far we've come in just a couple years in entering our third program, many people on this panel are responsible for this Denver Startup Week. And I say that in context because in the spring of 2011, the Startup America Partnership was really put into place by President Obama and a group of luminary CEOs across the United States. And Phil and Brad had the foresight with Jan Horsfall to bring that project to Colorado. And I was lucky enough to volunteer to help start to build out the Denver chapter well before my time at the Colorado Technology Association, where I am now. But they got me hooked. The topic for today, building startup communities, it's critical in the ecosystem development that we have here. And so with Brad's leadership and Phil's leadership, the Startup Colorado was born. At a lunch with Nancy, she said it would be so cool to celebrate something all week long. And I think the concept for Startup Week started to bubble up. And it's really fun to see how something small has grown into something now that I think we'll probably have close to 10,000 attendees this year. We had 180 events this week. And I think we're probably going to reach somewhere in the 60 to 70 million Twitter impressions by the end of the week. And so it's really, really, really grown. But Phil, it's my turn to introduce Phil, who's going to be moderating the panel today. It's been such a blessing to have a dean of the law school who's so deeply driving the entrepreneurial energy in not only Boulder, but in Colorado. When you look at the success of Silicon Flatirons that Phil runs, when you look at the integration of entrepreneurship and the curriculum at CU, he's really taking the practice of law and teaching entrepreneurship and lawyers how to really take advantage of being great leaders in their organizations, but also great entrepreneurs. Most recently, the reason we're here today is that he was the lead on the Colorado Blackstone Partnership and Initiative. And with that development, I think the Blackstone network is really starting to drive a lot of change, which JP Holston is here as well. But Phil, thank you for all your work. Thank you for being here this morning. Really excited for you to moderate this really great panel, and let us know when we want to start another Startup Week. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. There's a great Yiddish expression, which is let me say a few words before I speak. And so I want to invoke that here. Startup Colorado, I want to say a few words about that. Right here, John Delva is the executive director. If you want to get involved afterwards, you can talk to any of us, but particularly talk to John. One of his predecessors, Dave Mangum, is back in the room. Both John and Dave are following in the shoes of Betty Arkell, who's also here for Holland and Hart, who's been an unbelievable leader in our community. That's right, give it up for Betty Arkell. And appropriately, the law school is honoring Betty this year with the highest award we give our alums, and that's because of the leadership. The way she gives back to the community, it's a spirit that we'll talk about in this panel. It's very important to be catching, and Eric catching that spirit, I don't know that Brad or I can take much credit for it, but I will say this, and it's relevant to what we're going to talk about. I didn't know Eric at all before Startup Colorado, and he just started getting involved. He actually registered the domain startupcolorado.com. And then said, okay, guys, I did this, what do we do with it? And so we'll talk about that, but his leadership is exceptional. A few words I can say, and let me do a couple of slides quickly on Startup Colorado so people have some context. The goal is just to multiply connections among entrepreneurs and mentors. It's meant to be a platform, pretty lightweight, to help facilitate connections. We this year are going to have startup weeks in Denver, in Boulder, in Colorado Springs, and in Fort Collins. 3 years ago when we started Startup Colorado, I think Boulder had a startup week, but none of the other cities had. And then that lunch I remember Nancy was at, she's like, why don't we do something? And it's been a tremendous, reverberation of these different connections. What's happening down in Colorado Springs? Anyone here from the Springs here today? Okay, a few people are gonna come. Yeah, it's really phenomenal, really exciting. And there's different institutions that are starting up in Colorado Springs and Fort Collins, and we're all here helping each other. Number two, entrepreneurial education. So we talked a little bit, Eric did, about what's happening, but not just at CU Boulder, but CU Denver, Denver University, Colorado Springs, Fort Collins. The educational institutions are a part of this. We have a startup summer program that's been Denver, it's been in Boulder, and this summer we're planning to bring Colorado Springs. This is getting people to work with startup companies as summer interns. We've often heard about people go to Washington for summer internship and having an impact on their lives. That happened to me. Well, the next generation, we want people to have an impactful experience in a startup company. And for that matter, we're doing stuff with high schools too. Really exciting work. And then just building more vibrant community. We're in this together. Finding ways to connect people to community is really important. So no one can read this slide. This is like violating every rule of PowerPoint. There are a lot of people involved. It's basically, the point is we want to bring everyone together around the table, more metaphorically than literally, but both. If you want to get involved, just let one of us know. And then finally, we have a lot of key sponsors here. This has been tremendous to help us run this platform, and the Startup Summer signature event in particular has been something we're really proud of. And then for this event here, we want to thank also AMG, and I think Shannon Stone might be here from AMG somewhere. Hey, Shannon, thank you so much. Been a great support. So that's a quick point on Startup Colorado. JB is the executive director of the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network for Colorado, which literally came out of Startup Colorado. The people at the Blackstone Charitable Foundation had started sort of an alpha project of an entrepreneurs network in North Carolina, and they looked for the next place to go. Because of the great work that Brad Feld had done, because we had been working together with Startup Colorado, they said, wait a minute, this is the place to go to build an entrepreneurs network that works across sectors, across geographies, to have seasoned, successful entrepreneurs help emerging entrepreneurs. Very much the spirit of the Startup Colorado effort. The difference being the Entrepreneurs Network is more about scale up, not about startup. It's you get these gazelles, these companies who are building up momentum, helping them take the next step, and we're lucky to have JB as the executive director. The first point I want to start with, and this goes back to Eric, is the concept that everyone can get involved and make an impact. Last year at this breakfast, I don't think Bart Lorang is here today, but Bart was at that lunch we had, and Bart was on a panel. Bart just said, hey, the startup community, it's a doerocracy. And just like happens in the world we live in, I think you tweeted it that day, you then wrote a blog post about it, and we have a new concept, a doerocracy. So I want to start on that concept, and maybe, Brad, you can riff a little bit of what it means to be involved in a doerocracy.
Sure. I think we all have heard or know or have been part of organizations that talk about themselves as meritocracies. I think many of us also recognize the often ironic dynamics around meritocracies, which is it's total bullshit. And it's just sort of a feel-good way to describe an archetype of a business versus what actually happens. But in the optimistic view, a meritocracy is a construct that is powerful. It's not really the way it works in a startup community. And it's especially interesting to look at this sort of notion of how do people engage, develop reputation, develop influence, impact, and then contribute to a startup community. And Bart's comment around doerocracy is you just have to be doers. You just have to do stuff. And the idea that you have to ask permission, that you have to get approval, that you have to build consensus doesn't apply. If you're interested in something, engaging in something, starting something, doing something in the context of startup community, you just do. And it was such a sort of a clearly defined, sort of well-defined concept off of this word, this notion of just being a doer. Because oftentimes in a lot of startups, people talk about, let's just do shit, let's just get shit done, let's, work, do, make it happen. Don't wait for somebody to tell you it's okay. Don't wait to get permission. Don't wait to get approval. That construct really applies in the startup community. One of the things that I've said for a long time, I get, daily multiple people come to me and ask me, from around, Boulder and Denver, but also all over the country. I want to get involved in, the startup community. I want to move to Boulder. I want to move to Denver. I want to get involved in what's going on. What should I do? Right? So it's interesting that the word do sort of comes up always in those conversations. What I've started to do on my side, and maybe 3 or 4 years ago, as a reaction to that, was simply give people assignments. And a very interesting thing occurs. You give somebody an assignment, and my goal is to give them an assignment that can be done with very little knowledge, within an hour. So it's not a trivial thing to do, but it's something that takes a little bit of effort. But it doesn't require any specific knowledge or any specific historical interaction. 50% of the people go away and never come back. And I view that as a total blessing, right? Because they weren't going to do anything. And they were looking for something for themselves, but they weren't willing to put some energy into it in advance of engaging with the community. 25% of the people do the assignment and do the assignment really well. And that's great because those are people who, just by doing, they get involved. And they might come back and I'll give them another assignment that's a little more complicated, but most of the time they all of a sudden just start to do stuff and get involved. And then 25% of 25% of the people not only do the assignment, but it's spectacular how far beyond the assignment they go. And they actually use the assignment as a springboard, not to just get engaged in the startup community, but to start doing something that's important to them. And those people end up being the leaders of the startup community. So if you're on the other side of that conversation, which is I want to get more involved, I want to be part of the startup community, I want to be a leader in a startup community, recognize that it's just about doing. And you should do in your own self-interest. It's not about altruistic doing. It's about doing something that helps you with whatever your goals are in the context of how that contributes to the startup community.
So Jane, you were nodding, so maybe I should let you elaborate a little bit.
Thanks. So I have to first sort of have truth in lending, because I'm probably the least famous person up here, and I'm kind of a groupie of this group. So my name is Jane Miller, and I've been a longtime food person, a food industry executive, and was pulled into the startup community in the last couple of years, and it's been really, really amazing to be involved with it. And I think I want to just build a little bit on what Brad said, because one of the things that I'm super passionate about right now is this whole concept of it's building on the doing idea, but it is that everybody should really be a mentor and really should be involved in, I think, as you're saying, for your own self-interest, I think is great, but I think there's also this kind of pay it forward concept that is so big in the startup community, that while you're out there kind of looking for something, looking for a connection, that you're actually trying to help somebody else. And it could be for your own good in the long term, but I think this concept of sort of building your network without even having a purpose is a really, really big idea. That as you're just, as you're starting your business, as like everyone in this room, there may be someone here that you don't even know how they could help you at some point or how you could help them. But how do you make those connections? And I think in Boulder, where I live and where I'm really involved in the food community, it's been really interesting because unlike other communities, we're really out there sort of helping each other as opposed to competing with each other, which is there's enough room for everybody to be successful. And I think that's a really big concept if you can kind of move beyond, if you take the doing sort of to the next level, which is it's doing and it's sort of giving at the same time. I think you start to create a community that really is it just sort of multiplies, I guess, is maybe the best way to describe it.
So that's a great setup for JB, and I want to underscore this point. For those who've lived elsewhere, you have an appreciation, as do I, about different possible cultural norms. There's the norm that Jane just said, which is you help others and you root for them to succeed, versus the norm, wait a minute, if someone else is succeeding, that must be at my expense. And we've all, if you've spent time on the coast, seen that mentality, called a zero-sum mentality, and how destructive it is, and we should cherish the mentality and culture we have here. That concept of a give before you get, if you will, or a collaborative spirit is something that the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network is all about. JB, maybe you could riff on that theme a little bit.
Yeah, and I think we can't see a damn thing from up here, but I think Manisha Merchant, did you just walk in? Did you walk in? There she is. So I just wanted to call out Manisha. Manisha works for Senator Bennett, and the network would not have happened without Senator Bennett, but specifically without Manisha. So Manisha, thank you very much for that effort. So the Blackstone thing is like the coolest thing ever, and I'm really excited to be involved with it, and I'm having a lot of fun, and I break chairs as part of my excitement. Excuse me for doing that. But that's all right. If I fall down, it'll be really cool. That'll be a YouTube video for the long haul. But Blackstone is a late-stage private equity firm. They've got about $300 billion under management. They're not the sort of brand that you would normally associate with a startup community because that's not the phase or the stage of companies that they typically get involved in. But when they set up a charitable foundation a few years ago when they went public, they decided after not too long that they really wanted to support innovation and entrepreneurship communities around the country. And as Phil mentioned, they gave a sort of alpha effort in another part of the country. Senator Bennett met with some of the senior folks at Blackstone a couple of years ago, and that helped kick off a process to talk to a lot of the folks here in the community about what was Colorado missing that they could help support. And they heard two things. One was that we've got silos. And the canonical example I give is kind of the natural foods mafia up in Boulder versus this emerging aerospace innovation community out of Colorado Springs. There are a lot of reasons why those communities don't necessarily talk to one another, but they're really powerful communities, which when mixed together can do a lot of really interesting things. So they heard that there were silos. And the other thing they heard was that while we're doing a great job creating the conditions for innovation and entrepreneurship here in the state, we don't have as many scale-up successes as we should or we could. And there are a couple of things that we miss when we don't have more of those. One is we don't have as much managerial muscle memory. I can say that one time, and then I can't say it again. But we don't have as many folks locally who've been through the process of taking a company from 5 million to 10 to 100 to a billion to a public offering, et cetera. And without that, we tend to try to recruit those folks from outside. And believe it or not, it's still difficult to recruit a lot of those folks to come here. They tend to get caught up in their own ecosystems and their own views of opportunity wherever they are locally. So we don't have enough managerial muscle memory. I said it twice. And then the other thing is it can be tough for capital raising. We still have this notion on the coasts that they can't put enough work here, enough capital to work here. It isn't going to get to a big enough outcome. So why should they bother? They're totally wrong and they're stupid if they think that, but there is some of that. And there's a little bit of argument that may just be a mythology, but at any rate, that's a view. So Blackstone said those are categories where we think that we can help. And they'd met Phil and they'd met Brad through the process as well. They loved the fact that Phil through CU it was kind of at the epicenter of the whole startup world, and so said, look, let's give a gift to CU to create, through Phil's organization, through Silicon Flatirons, to create this thing called the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network. So that's like a prolegomena. Yes, I was an English major. That's sort of an introduction to what the thing's all about. I think relevant to the topic that Phil was mentioning, the thing that's been most startling to me in getting involved with this over the last 2 to 3 months, and it shouldn't be, but it has been, is again the manifestation of the pay it forward attitude on the part of folks willing to help and folks in companies that are at the scale-up point. We've been looking at companies that have raised over 150 million of capital already. We've been talking to companies that are 100 million in revenue already. And those companies and the CEOs of those companies have said, look, we can benefit by being part of that ecosystem as much as any startup thinks they may be able to benefit by being part of that ecosystem. So that's been interesting and a little bit unexpected. And the other thing that's been great, and I think unexpected, is how willing all of the senior folks who are really well connected have been to get involved and spend time to help those companies scale as well. And the best example I can give of that is this panel. Right, so Jane has dived in and is helping one of our really fast-rising, really cool entrepreneurial companies here in town that's in the broadly writ kind of in the generic pharmaceuticals business. And that was kind of an unexpected connection that came out of a process that we've set up to meet a lot of these great companies. Nancy, who in the meantime sold her company for $1.2 billion, is helping this small $25 million services company that may well have her company as a client, but also has a couple of really great young entrepreneurs. How fast they can scale. I mean, there are a number of questions, but she's dived in to help them. She has no time to do that. Brad, who has less time than anybody on the planet, has actually taken point with another company that just happened to be at a point where all of the issues that they need to grapple with over the next period of time are things that Brad is particularly wonderfully adept at dealing with. So, that's just an example of the kind of pay it forward in yet another context that came out of nowhere that I think is just fundamental to the culture here. And I think it really is unique to the culture here. And we all have to celebrate that, and we have to remember it. I guess the last thing I'd say on this is I was with a bunch of Israeli VCs a week ago, and they were saying, the one thing that Colorado lacks is chutzpah. More of your companies need to have more chutzpah. And I will make that as an observation. I think one of the things that we've learned in talking to a lot of these companies is we have phenomenal stories. We have phenomenal successes out there. And part of the trick in getting more of these companies to look like scale-up successes is to just claim that they are, is to just shout about it. So if you've got one or you've got one in the offing, have chutzpah, shout out about it, let us know.
So in the chutzpah category, it's interesting, Jane saying she's under noticed, and I think that's the modesty that many of us in Colorado have. JB and I came from the East Coast, so maybe we're not as humble as that. We're willing to shout out and celebrate. But what she did...
We're Jane groupies.
Exactly. We're Jane groupies. I mean, what she did with Rudy's Bakery, and now she's been involved in Riesel Institute, is extraordinary. What Nancy did with ViaWest was extraordinary. To get $1 billion exit is not a small thing. To build a great company who then finds the right exit that stays committed to Colorado is not a small thing. And I know that for both Jane and Nancy, it may be not the most pleasant thing to talk about yourself and your perspective, but I just want to say, Nancy, you have been involved in Startup Colorado from the beginning. This Denver effort, you've been the ground floor. You're on the steering committee for the Black Entrepreneurs Network. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective of how you go about, viewing the community and why and how you're doing what you do?
Yeah, I think we just need more PR or something. Maybe we should get a joint PR agency, Jane. We can get out there and promote the wonderful stories. But
Great.
We're too busy to talk about it. We're doing, right, instead of talking. But I reflected. It was interesting. We obviously met a wonderful milestone in the company's history on September 2nd when we closed with Shaw Communications. And you're right. It was kind of the trifecta. It was a great financial outcome. It was a wonderful outcome for our employees because we're going to remain headquartered here. We're going to grow the U.S. market and take our brand up to Canada. That's pretty unique. And as a matter of fact, I had a customer say, "I hear you bought Shaw the other day." And I said, "You just keep thinking that because that's not a bad way to go." But yeah, chutzpah. But what I reflected on, because people ask me, they say, "Well, how did you start in '99, and did you envision what was going to happen, and what were those fundamental things?" And I would say, if we had not started the company here in Denver, Colorado, we would not have been as successful. I really believe foundationally, and I came from Toronto originally, and to Phil's point, it is different. And, interesting enough, I was in Austin the other day, and I can't find the hub of entrepreneurialism there. You can go down to Boulder, and you can feel it, and you can come into Denver, and you start to feel it when you're walking around the streets. And when I was in Austin, I said, where is it? Where is it? And so I really look at Denver as fundamentally, there's a, we were talking about the doing mentality. It's not about talking. It's in our blood. It's in our DNA to go do things, execute, right? Not talk about it, but actually go, take the inertia and do something. And so there was a thriving, not well-known entrepreneurial community here that quietly went about their business and were supported by some interesting infrastructure. And as we continue to build the organization, that only continued to thrive, and some of those individuals continued to build connections quietly, but with a lot of impact. And building a regional company, because I had a lot of people say, "Hey, Nancy, why don't you go national? What's with this regional approach?" And I said, that is so valuable to be able to work in a region, build long-term relationships, and have an enduring contact with your customer, and really feel like you're building and enabling the community. And so I absolutely give a ton of credit that we either just felt like this was a great place to live and build a business and we got lucky, or quite frankly, it was just this community that helped us thrive. And so I give a huge shout out to Colorado, because ViaWest would not be here if we had not started the company here and had such a phenomenal support infrastructure to kind of get it done. The other thing I would say, it's the little things. I think people get deterred because it's like, I'm really busy and somebody's asking me to get involved, or I feel like I should get involved because this is of interest to me. but it's one additional thing. It's little things along the way. And if I were to look back at the history of iWest, I'd say it was all the tiny things, the little things along the way that made the difference. And whether it was a phone call from an associate who provided an introduction, whether it was mentoring along the way that I received from a great group of individuals that I look at as phenomenal friends that will be for life. It was all the little things along the way. It was never a big thing. It was all little things along the way that supported it. And I think that's what startup communities are about. They're not about big things. It's not about writing the $1 million check. It's about the little things along the way that each of you can do to contribute. And that's how we got started. I mean, it was all the little things. Now we can write $1 million checks, but it's taken a long time, and it's those things that really move the dialogue, the discussion, and what you see today. It was Eric Matisek doing a little thing, a domain, startupcolorado.com. Now what do you want to do? So I would really encourage you as entrepreneurs, as you think about it's the little things along the way, how you connect the tiny things that may not seem like a big deal to you, but can have a tremendous downstream effect in terms of the success of this community.
So I'm feeling a good blog post in that coming, the little things, and it tees up Brad to explain something that Brad's thought a lot about, which is how to think differently about what it means to give before you get versus pay it forward. And I think in your conversation, you hit both points, right? When you write the $1 million check because you want to help out, you've been successful, that's paying it forward. But the way that we help each other with little things often is giving before you get, in the sense that it will come back to you. Brad, could you explain a little bit on that distinction?
Sure. So I first started really thinking about this when I wrote the Startup Communities book. And I picked the words pretty carefully. So, pay it forward is a phrase that is pretty well understood and is a powerful construct. But pay it forward has an element of pure altruism to it, right? Somebody did something for you once, and you're going to pay it forward. The problem is that there's a lot of people who haven't yet felt like they've accomplished something that they can pay forward. And so it gets in the way of this construct. So I started using the phrase "give before you get" as a cousin to pay it forward. And now you'll hear a lot. It started with Techstars, and it's deeply wired into the fabric of Techstars. In fact, you'll see the hashtag on a lot of stuff, #GiveFirst. There's a book coming out that I've written that'll probably be out by the end of the year, maybe January, called Give First, and it uses the Techstars Mentor Manifesto, which is 18 points of how to be an extraordinary mentor, and really expands that. I've been blogging about that recently, and that'll end up becoming the book. So there's a lot of history now, 4 or 5 years of discussion and activity around Give Before You Get, wired into the fabric of a lot of things. I want to define it very simply, which is the notion of give before you get, or give first, is that you enter into a relationship non-transactionally. So you enter into a relationship without knowing what you're going to get back from that relationship. It's not altruistic. You expect to get something back, but you don't know from whom, when, in what currency, in what form you're going to get back. So you're willing to put energy into the system in advance of knowing transactionally what you're going to get out of the system. Get your mind around that construct. That is the magic of a startup community. If you can get everybody engaging in the startup community by putting energy in before they necessarily know what they're going to get back, you get this very, very powerful flywheel going of activity that then starts to generate lots of things. It's the little things that all of a sudden start adding up. Interestingly, when I reflect on how I've lived my own business life, now I'm in my late 40s, and I started my first company when I was 19. So for the last 30 years, without realizing it, that became the underpinnings of the way I essentially ran things. Now ran my own life. Now that's not to say that I don't have transactional relationships, right? I'm a VC, I invest in companies. Here's some money, when you have your exit, give me what you think I should get. that's not definitionally the dynamic. So there's plenty of transactional stuff in business, but the philosophy underpinning it is that you're willing to help anyone. You're willing to be collaborative. You're willing to put some energy in without necessarily knowing what comes back to you.
So can I give a great example of that? I think Phil mentioned I'm involved with the Unreasonable Institute. Does anybody know what that is? So it's a social impact accelerator, based in Boulder. And 2 years ago, we had one of the entrepreneurs that came was from Liberia. And if you know the history of Liberia, they were in civil war for many years, and sort of two dynamics came out of that. One was that all the young boys starting at age 9 became child soldiers. And the other was that the biggest sort of cash generation in Liberia were the cocoa fields, and they were all devastated. So Sheikh Touré came to the Unreasonable Institute with the idea that what he was going to do to sort of change the world was to train child soldiers to harvest the cocoa crop. And in that way, he would actually take these young men that had been wielding guns since they were 9 and give them an education, or an education in terms of a job, so sort of on-the-job training, which would also help the economy. And so part of the beauty of the Unreasonable Institute is what we try to do is provide great mentorship to give these companies wings. And so just to your example about sort of connections and how you don't know what you're going to get out of it. So I was one of the mentors, and I don't know anything about Liberia and don't really know very much about chocolate. And so I made the connection, except for eating it, exactly. So I was very valuable in that sense, and I ate all the product he brought. So I went, literally was trying to say, who do I know that could help this guy? So basically I went on LinkedIn, found a guy that I started my career at Frito-Lay in Dallas, who started with me about 30 years ago, who's now at Hershey's. Out of the blue, I get in contact with this guy at Hershey's. He then puts me in touch with their head of their commodities, who is actually on the board of the World Cocoa Foundation. I get the president of the World Cocoa Foundation to talk to me, who then connects me with the NGO that's based in Liberia that can actually help train the child soldiers for Sheikh Touré. And it's one of those amazing stories where you just don't know how the connections are going to land. Because again, I would not know anything about Liberia, about the cocoa harvest, but through just sort of this series of giving first kind of connections, we made a huge difference in his initiative and how he's changing the lives of people in Liberia.
Well, and that's a very interesting point. It starts here, the cultural norm in our community, and it is across the world, this concept of networks and mentoring. When we started looking at how to do the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network, it was very clear that one person had an extremely deep understanding of what we were trying to do, and that was JB. You thought a lot about this concept of building a network and about how mentoring has this impactful, result on companies and economic growth here. So JB, could you talk a little about those two concepts?
Yeah, I think, let me just, there we go. One of the things that I think we found, so just a little backtrack, we've got about 140 folks who are signed up now as advisors in the network, and we've probably got about 20 that we're going to add to that over the next couple of weeks. And we've talked to probably about 130 companies at this point, and we've formally got about 18 that are in the network at this stage. And it's been really fascinating. The having a person on point for the 140 for each company, each of those 18, is one of the real benefits of the network, right? So if you're a CEO of one of those companies, those 140 folks have these phenomenal networks that are really, really interesting and valuable for you. But if you got 140 email addresses and we're told, great, here you go, here's the benefit, nothing would happen. So by having somebody on point who can kind of, by networking across that network and then connecting the networks of those networks back to those companies, phenomenal things occur. So mentoring in the context of scale up is a really interesting thing that's kind of emerging as a pattern out of this, and it's a lot more about connecting those networks in a really functional, fast fashion than it is necessarily the same kind of mentoring that you might do with much earlier stage companies, where a lot of very specific kinds of things in a programmatic way over a particular period of time are needed. So that's sort of one interesting thing that's emerged about what mentoring means in the context of these scale-up companies. Another thing is the narrative, is just telling the stories. And I was a little ironic about being chutzpah, but not terribly. I mean, we should tell these great stories more and more loudly as a community. And I think one of the things that I think is really we're finding is that if we all do that more regularly, a lot of really good things can happen. So telling the narrative is another really powerful thing for any stage company. I mean, even a company which has wonderful networks going in can get a lot of unexpected benefit by connecting to other networks. All of them can benefit by all of us cheering from the ramparts about their story and about what they've done. And I guess to tie all that stuff together, probably the biggest learning of all of this, and it shouldn't be a surprise, but it very much, I think, talks to your point about little things, is serendipity matters. And it's also not, a brand, but it matters a ton. So you can't predict, when you connect these networks of networks, you have no way to predict who actually knows who that's going to be functional for what. You just can't know that going in. But if you can make those connections a lot more seamless, a lot more quick, and a lot more efficient and effective, serendipity comes to play. And it's incredibly additive. But the thing about it is you can't go into these kinds of processes and say, well, clearly, this is the outcome and these are the connections and these are the only things that are going to be really beneficial. It's very much to your example, Jane. You just don't know. But by going in and getting folks engaged and trying to be really functional about it, having the right kind of attitude when you go into it, you get that serendipity to go. And as that serendipity goes, phenomenal things happen. And they're just a ton of great examples of that. I won't go into those. Maybe we'll have time later. But I think that's something that really has resonated for me too.
Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, I think it parallels the way you run your business, right? I mean, you want a workforce that comes in and is supportive, enabling, and doesn't necessarily expect some return in terms of the way they interact with their peers within the workforce. And so I think of it in terms of the mirroring of, we talk about startup communities, but it's an ecosystem within your businesses as well, right? So if you practice, a long time ago somebody said, listen, the very best CEOs or leaders in the world are the ones who, wear the exact same hat when they go home, the way they interact in the community, and what they do in their businesses. And so it's not that hard if it's the way you just practice your approach in your 24-hour lives. So I think about it in the business and the power that goes into that. So if we build a phenomenal ecosystem here, which we have in so many ways, but you have to continue to work at it, and then that translates into the way we work as leaders within the organizations that we run, that is extraordinarily powerful. And that's when you see companies that are truly aligned and communities that are extraordinarily aligned, and the power that comes with that is really, really phenomenal. You get to those levels, and it just becomes legendary in the country. And I think that's what we all envision. Colorado is a great place. We're not that well known, and don't beat our chests as loudly as the coasts do. But that underground movement and how quickly, eventually, it will become legendary. I think it's just a matter of time.
So one last concept, then I want to get the audience engaged, and it flows perfectly from what Nancy said. We are in the move from a transition of a world of hierarchy and stability to networks and change or adaptability. And that's a pretty profound shift. When you think about the world 30 years ago, people could still go to work for IBM or AT&T and think they were going to be an organizational man or woman. Today, people don't think that way anymore. And so we're in the midst of this change. I believe we in Colorado are ahead of the curve in that change. And it's still hard for people to wrap their minds around what is a fundamentally different way to operate. Brad, you've thought about that concept a bit too. Might you say a word or two on that?
Sure. So human beings have really crummy medium-term memory. Generally have good short-term memory and good long-term memory, but we really just have this blind spot in the 5 to 10 year time frame. If you think back 5 years, 2009, the world was going to end. Right? 2008, 2009, global financial crisis, governments were going to fail, the entire global banking system was going to fail, entire countries were going to fail. Everything would be different in the future because of that. Now, it turns out that, in 2010, 2011, many of those constructs were false. But many of them fundamentally were true in terms of what changed. And I really view that as the point at which this hierarchy network dynamic crossed over. Hierarchies have existed as a way to organize labor since the beginning of time, right? Whether it's religion or military, where we're as humans, we're I won't point to myself, the other humans are units of labor. Or businesses used hierarchies to organize labor. And they used hierarchies to organize labor back when we were an agricultural and a manufacturing or industrial society. As we shifted from a manufacturing industrial society to an information-based society, the notion of networks started to appear. And 30 years ago, when people talked about networks, it was an academic, intellectual conversation. And most of the time when I would end up being involved in conversations about networks, they were very, people were mystified, and it was sort of interesting, but maybe intellectually. Today, when we talk about networks, it's commonplace because we all are part of them and use them, whether it be Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, things that in our natural sort of normal life, we're already part of these digital networks that are driven by communication, where no longer does the hierarchy matter. Right? If you want to get in touch with me, I'm easy to get in touch with. I'm brad@feld.com, I'm @bfeld on Twitter. You can get a message to me, and I participate in the network, so if you get a message to me, almost all the time I will respond. I'll try to respond. Occasionally I get overwhelmed and some things fall through the cracks, but most of the time I'm responsive. You don't have to go through a gatekeeper. You don't have to ask permission. You don't have to go up navigate some tree, or navigate some hierarchy to get to me. If you think about 2009, 2010, and you think about startups, in 2008 and 2007 as well, by the way, again, remember we're crummy at history, 2005, 10 years ago, you couldn't raise seed financing for a tech company if you were a successful entrepreneur and you begged. So only in a decade has that sort of capital dynamic changed so dramatically. It's easy to think today, wow, there's so much amazing startup activity going on. But even in 2008, 2009, 2010, there was a real dearth of capital and a real struggle for startups as well as scaling up companies versus today. So just remember that the sort of medium-term memory is often lost as you think about what's going on today. I believe, and I would assert, that the fundamental difference today going forward for the next 50 years is that the importance of networks are now greater than the importance of hierarchies. And that happened in this 2008-2009 transition. It's not that hierarchies are unimportant. It's not that hierarchies go away, but that great hierarchies will learn how to attach themselves to networks so that those organizations are more powerful. That networks will be good at including individuals who are part of hierarchies who want to engage in the network to extend the network. And that the barriers to be able to engage with each other, whether it's give first, or whether it's mentorship, or whether it's getting engaged, whether it's doing, the barriers to that are dramatically lower than they've ever been because of this phenomena of a network. The last comment I'll make on it, in a hierarchy, the way you gain power is you move up the hierarchy. And all hierarchies have ways that you move up them. They may not all be the same from one company to the next, or from military or government or religion, but you gain power in the hierarchy by moving up the hierarchy. In a network, you gain power not by having more connections to your node on the network, but by having more activity coming in and going out of your node. So your node grows as more activity occurs. And that activity can happen over a relatively small number of network links or a lot of network links. It's probably easier to have it happen over a lot of network links, so having more connections to the network is better. But if you have lots and lots of connections and there's no activity, you have a very small node on the network. The network routes around you. So think about that in the context of your own progression and the idea of engaging as a way to develop power in the construct, power, influence, whatever, in the construct of the network. Sorry.
That's okay. One commercial advertisement for silicon flat irons and making a connection. The change in telecommunications over this 30-year period was from hierarchy to networks. In 1984, the world was IBM circuit switching, controlled by central circuits, and IBM was the kind of reigning computer. Remember the Apple Mac commercial? That was the old world. The new world is packet switching. It's internet-based. It's network neutrality, where anyone who wants to develop an application can do so, and people can access it. So for those interested in that piece of it, Silicon Flatirons had a lot of chance to reflect on it. We had a great conference recently on disruptive innovation in the internet world, which is different than in telecom and different than electricity. So this dynamic of innovation in networked world is a fascinating area. People want to catch me and talk about policy issues for entrepreneurs. It's important for us to be aware of and not take for granted. So that's a separate conversation people want to have it. So let's maybe get the audience involved a little bit. Do you have a mic? You want to use my mic, John, or James? Okay, so questions, thoughts. We've given a lot of good food for thought. This has been an amazing discussion. We'd love to get your thoughts and questions. Sure, go ahead. And please introduce yourself, too.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Kevin Jones, and now represent a company called Ingenious Softworks. And just quickly, I went down to Uruguay last year for quite a while, and it just affirms so much of what we're talking about. First of all, they are a country very much like Colorado is in terms of size and their population entrepreneurship. And I felt like a one-man advocate for Colorado because they were only thinking about the coasts. And it sounded so hard to penetrate the coast. And I was talking about relationships in Colorado, and very quickly brought a really terrific leader back to Colorado for a couple weeks of meetings. And he was overwhelmed with the need to have relationships in order to develop his business here. It was not as transactional as he had thought it would be. And it just really reaffirmed. But everybody was willing to help, and he was kind of overwhelmed with joy in the way that he was. But I was hoping, JB, you could talk a little bit about breaking down silos, because you mentioned that first, and I think that that's an important point.
Yeah, no, happy to. I mean, when we were launching this whole thing, I had a funny conversation with the governor, who's also been a big supporter of this, and he said, "Oh, this is great. You're going to get all these great folks together and all these great companies, and you can just do it all digitally." And I said, "Governor, you were a bartender. What are you talking about? You don't break down silos by just giving everybody yet another social network and telling them go play. In person matters. So a lot of what we're doing are events. We consciously bring 20 of these advisors together with 3 companies, one after another, in person to talk. And the serendipitous point, it's the conversations in the hallways between the advisors that didn't know one another where all this great dynamic is occurring. I think, and one of the great things about Colorado is, we're only 5 million people. I mean, that sounds like a lot, but we're not that big. And so it's not that hard to get to know in person a lot of folks that matter, or that, can matter to whatever it is that you're looking to do. So I think one of the takeaways for me is that in person matters a ton. And a lot of what we're doing is that. So when we do these sessions, for example, we make sure that we've got all the 5 industries represented. And we typically have companies at various stages of growth and from different industries too, because part of the conversation we want to get going is, we had this great company from Boulder that's started by a couple of, everyone's young to me, but young entrepreneurs who are DU grads, GU aside, they're DU grads, and it's this wonderful natural foods company, incredible energy. And the folks that loved it the most were, kind of these old codger aerospace guys, and they wouldn't mind that I say that because they'd say that about themselves. And they were like, "Oh, this is like the coolest thing ever! I can't believe it!" And they couldn't stop eating the stuff right in the meeting. But that's it would have been one thing to just sort of send them the PowerPoint and say, "Consume this and let us know what you think," and then respond back and give it grades and all. It's totally different to have them in a room where that could happen. Scaling all that is why I think things like Startup Week are so critical. Right, because what are there 180 events here, and the number of connections that get made through that amount of activity is just it's unmeasurable. I'm sure.
And another thought on that. Thanks. Another thought, just to build on that, is one thing that's came out for me is I actually, as being a food person, have sat in a lot of meetings with the other industries, and it's been really fascinating. This sort of when you have a different perspective, not coming from the industry, it makes actually a big difference in how you look at it. I mean, actually, Nancy and I were talking about this earlier. How even though our businesses are very, very different and our backgrounds are different, the way we process things and look at things can be really insightful. So I would actually ask you, as you're looking at sort of your mentor network and who you reach for, not just look for someone who's in the same vertical, but maybe someone who could look at your business with a different lens, because I think that's one of the powers of the Blackstone Network, is seeing things that I never would have seen because I'd only been connected with the food industry.
And you'd be amazed at how much value, I was talking to one of the really great, historic, iconic marketeers in Boulder yesterday, and he was like, well, I only can help, consumer-facing companies. And I'm like, every company's a consumer-facing company now. I mean, his expertise is incredibly valuable for so many technology companies now, which are struggling with the consumerization of IT. And so that's part of. You probably don't know that your background may have phenomenal utility exactly now in some industry category you thought you had no relationship to.
I think one other thing, Brad and I talked years ago because we were chatting about, there's this corridor between Boulder and Denver, and how do we bridge that, and Colorado Springs and Fort Collins, and I would say that's around. So those were like little silos, and similarly around many of the associations, in terms of Colorado Technology Association, Startup Colorado, Ben. I think if you go in with a spirit of everybody's bringing something to the table, and that we have very common interests. The interconnections amongst many of these are really very intertwined. And so as you're involved from different associations and interests, I'd really encourage you to open your mind around being inclusive and reaching out to these organizations to see how you can work with each other to create a really, a scaling of time and energy, and certainly benefiting from best practices or capabilities that each brings to the table. And I think we've seen a lot of that. Eric's been, he's interconnected so many of these pieces, and he's a common, individual amongst many of them. And I think that glue has really helped us become a better force in the community.
Another question?
Hi, guys. Adam Rentschler. Thank you so much for another wonderful panel session. So mentorship has been on my mind all week. In fact, I hosted a panel session on that yesterday at Industry. And one of the things that came up, I'd love to get the panel's input on, and that's the danger of give before you get becoming give and then give some more and then give some more. So there is this danger that this attitude could be unsustainable, particularly if the entrepreneurs aren't doing their part and themselves giving back to the community that is supporting them. So could you guys talk a little bit about whether or not you perceive that as being a danger in the long run in terms of mentor burnout, and what we as entrepreneurs can do to make sure that we're putting enough back into the system to support it?
Let me say a few thoughts on that. It's a great question, and I know Brad's got a few as well. In the Jewish tradition, there is a concept you can give too much charity, which is not what we're talking about necessarily, but it's protected in the same way, which is if it's at your expense and you can't have your business or family be supported, that could be a problem. Now, for most people, that's not the issue, right? There are a few people for whom they're giving and it's at the expense of their company or their family, and that is a problem. You have to protect yourself. And so there is an important idea to be self-conscious about. Brad has thought a lot about this and has written a book called Startup Marriage. Was that Startup Life? And Brad has developed a series of strategies to help him reserve time so that he can have balance. So maybe you could talk a little about that. I think that's the spirit of the question, if I've got it right. Is that right?
It's more how we as entrepreneurs can make sure that we're putting stuff back into the system so that mentors feel like they're getting something explicit back from us. Maybe it's in an unexpected way, and that's fine, but what can we do to get back?
I think that as an entrepreneur, one of the things to realize is that the best mentor-mentee relationships are when they become peer relationships. So a mentor, if somebody is being a mentor to you, the magic happens when they're learning as much from their experience with you as you are with them. So the first is, if you're on the receiving end of mentorship, to constantly be putting energy into helping your mentor with whatever is interesting to them. And don't do it in the, so what can I do to be helpful to you mode, right? Like, I get that question 10 times a day, and the answer is just do whatever is interesting to you. Do the work to figure out what is important to that person that's putting energy into you. And don't necessarily do something that's direct back to them. They're not looking for direct compensation most of the time in terms of the context of it. But the amplification of one of their initiatives, whether it's a business or something they've written, or something that's important to them, or one of the organizations that they're part of or support, figuring out how you can put back some units of energy to that mentor's own initiatives starts to develop a peer relationship. So that's one. Second, there's a magic moment that happens when a company is successful. And I've had this experience personally a number of times where the company is successful, and I don't have an economic relationship with the company, but I've been involved, I've been a mentor, I've done something. And I'll think of one specific example of a company that a good friend of mine, become a good friend of mine, Krista Marks, was a CEO of a company called Kerpoof, and I passed on investing in Kerpoof. It wasn't something that I wanted to invest in, but I like Krista, and I like Brent, and I like her other partners, and I like what they were doing, so I was helpful over the years as a mentor. And when she got approached, the company was acquired by Disney. When she was approached by Disney, she called me up and said, I don't know what to do. Can you be helpful? And she probably would have been willing to pay me some transactional thing to be helpful. I don't know, maybe not. I said, sure, I'll be helpful. And I introduced her to Mike Platt, who was at Cooley, who became her lawyer. Throughout the negotiation, I played an advisory role to her. I didn't play a principal role in the negotiation, but I probably talked to her 15 or 20 times over the course of the next 60 days, including a couple of hour plus long calls where during a negotiation where you have to talk the person off the ledge because they want to kill the corp dev person on the other side, and it was just in the spirit of mentorship. And at the end of the process, she sent me a note and she said, I want to contribute to something, some of the proceeds from the deal. I want to give it to something that matters to you. Not to me, Krista, but to you, Brad, sort of as a thank you for all the help you did. Which, by the way, meant way more to me than the $50,000 or $100,000 she might have given me in the context of being an advisor to the deal. And she made a contribution to National Center for Women in Information Technology. That was a substantial contribution. It's an organization I'm chair of. She's subsequently become involved and put a lot of her time into it. That's an example of how it can come back in an unexpected way. And the amount of money she gave, the value, the emotional value to me was probably 100 times the economic value. So I think those two examples, right? The first example, try to build over time a peer relationship by doing things where you're giving value back to the mentor who's investing in you. And then the second is when you have success, and there have been people that have helped you with the success, be gracious. One last example, I was in California Tuesday, and I had a dinner Tuesday night. Jeff Clavier, who runs a firm called Softtech VC, is an investor in a number of companies in Colorado. It's a Bay Area firm. Just raised his fourth fund. And he has a dinner every time he raises a fund for a small group of people who have been helpful to him in getting Softtech started and in each of the subsequent fundraising. He usually involves one new person or has another new person invited to the dinner. And I've been to each of the dinners because I was one of the first investors in his fund. And I was one of the, early, he refers to me as an early mentor. I've learned as much from Jeff as he's learned from me, but somebody who was helpful to him in getting Softtech up and running. For no economics, there was nothing defined around it. And in fact, I was an investor, so I have some economics by virtue of being an investor. The dinner that he puts on, he's French, and he loves wine. And he loves the social aspect of a group of people. I don't like. I've been traveling very little, so for me to go to California just for dinner is actually effort. I spent the day. We're investors in a company called Fitbit, so I turned it into a useful day, and then I had this most amazing 4-hour dinner. Not just with Jeff though. Josh Koppelman, who's from First Round Capital, another name that some people may be familiar with, has some Colorado investments as well. Josh has also been an early investor advisor. Josh and I are good friends, but I haven't seen Josh in 18 months.
Philadelphia, right?
Philadelphia. And, we interact with each other a lot, but we spent four very intimate hours together at this dinner, which, by the way, in addition to being a wonderful dinner, Jeff, who is very much into wine, has an incredible wine cellar and brought wines that were his best wines and shared with us, right? So just so much more valuable than if I had a little piece of carry and Softtech VC, just that acknowledgement and the creation of the environment of intimacy and the emotional reward that you get from all the hard work and all the contribution. As a person on the mentor side, it's very powerful.
Well, on that spiritual note, which I think is a worthy one to end on, now's a chance for people here. All the people on this panel are extremely approachable, and I think what Nancy said was right. That's how people are living their lives. So within their organizations, within their families, within communities, that's what this is about, and we have a chance to do something very special in Colorado, and we have to have more chutzpah to publicize it. This platform of Denver Startup Week has been phenomenal. I know many people here have been a part of making it successful. Thank you all so much, and let's take a chance to visit a little bit before people go on their days. Thanks so much.